I'm Dana McMakin. I'm at Florida International University. I'm an associate professor there, and I work in the psychology department. And most of my job is research, science. So trying to understand the emotional and social lives of children and adolescents. And I'm particularly interested in the role of sleep and how sleep impacts how we function emotionally and socially. And I've been doing this for quite a few years. So I've been a scientist for about 20 years. And then in addition, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I work with adolescents and older kids at Nicholas Children's Hospital in their psychology division doing therapy.
And I don't know if you could tell us why it's so important to sleep good?
Throughout the lifespan, right? So across our entire lives, we spend about 1/3 of our lives asleep, which is sort of crazy if you think about it, right? And if you look at the amount that people sleep during different times in their lives, one of the things we've noticed is that you sleep the most when you're learning the most. So young babies sleep almost 15 to 17 hours a day out of the 24-hour cycle because they're learning so much new stuff and their brain is so active processing that information. As you get a little bit older, you sleep a little bit less, but still quite a bit. So school-age children, for example, sleep anywhere from 10 to 13 hours. And then as you get a little bit older into the early adolescent period, you're looking at more like 9 to 11, and then high schoolers, 8 to 10 hours. And then as adults, 7 to 8 hours. So across the lifespan, the amount of sleep that you need keeps going down as your brain kind of stabilizes with all the new information that it's learning. And that's also true on a day-to-day basis. So on a day when you learn a whole lot, you're more likely to show certain features of sleep that night that show that your brain is actually processing that information overnight. So in a very specific way, we think that we sleep essentially to process all the information that we're learning throughout the day. And a lot of that information is emotional. So a lot of what our brain decides it needs to go through at night is stuff that we've experienced during the day that we had an emotional reaction to, because the brain says, I think that's probably really important. I want to hold on to that. And so while you sleep, it processes that information. So what I think is really interesting is that we think of sleep as this time when we are unconscious or unresponsive to the world. And in some ways that's true, but it's also true that we're not just laying there. Our brain is actually really busy doing really important things while we sleep that it can't necessarily do during waking hours. So that's why it's so critical to sleep. And it's why you see sleep not only in humans, but we see animals sleeping, rodents sleeping, like all mammals sleep. So all animals find some way to sleep. And that tells us as scientists that sleep must be very important if all of these animals are finding unique ways to do it. So everyone prioritizes sleep. And as humans, it can be really hard with all the things we have going on during the day to make time for it. And so that's one of the things I'm interested in talking with young people about, is about all the reasons, some that I just mentioned, as well as others, that it's so important to sleep and to prioritize time for sleep.
Hi, my name is Mattfeld. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I study how the brain supports learning and memory and how those kind of basic cognitive mechanisms change as a function of development and different neurodevelopmental disorders. So the questions that I'm mostly interested in are, how does the brain as like a biological thing do all of the cool things that it does? And one of those cool things is, how do we learn things and how do we remember them? Every organism that we know sleeps to some extent. And so if you don't sleep, you die.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
And so during sleep, it's doing lots and lots and lots of things. So one of the things, like as we are awake, our neurons are talking to each other and they're building up kind of the strength in which they talk to each other. So they're building new synapses, and like eventually that has to kind of go back. And so one of the parts of sleep is taking all of that buildup and then putting it back to baseline. So putting it back to the way it was before.
I was going to clarify with you, Aaron, so that we don't scare our viewers who may be struggling with sleep, that when you say that if you don't sleep, you die, can you expand on that a bit to be clear about the conditions in which one would die from not sleeping? It would be many, many days.
Yes, it would be like if you actually could not ever fall asleep. And there are disorders of the brain where it's impossible for you to fall asleep. So with disorders of sleep, they can contribute to problems, but it is pretty extreme in which you actually die.
Yeah. I don't know if you want to talk, both of you, about your study, how these parts of the brain are talking to each other.
So our study's really, really fun. It's like a blast. So we're, again, interested in how sleep and emotions affect how we remember things. And we tend to kind of generalize things that are negative, right? And so we're interested in how sleep and anxiety and kind of like how the brain really, all of these things come together. So the way we do this is, and so what I mean by generalize is, I mean, if I have a horrible thing happen to me, like my house burns down, I may generalize and go to a campfire and think, oh, campfires are not fun, because I had that kind of horrible kind of negative thing. And so for people that suffer from anxiety, that kind of negative attribution kind of permeates and kind of is generalized across many different kind of episodes. So we want to know, how do all of these things come together? So the way we do this is we invite people to kind of participate in filling out questionnaires. And then once they fill out the questionnaires and we see that they're eligible for our study, we then invite them to come to the MRI machine. So an MRI machine is just a big magnet, and it helps take pictures of your brain. And really, we're not actually, at that time, we're not measuring electrical activity. So neurons actually are talking to other neurons through electrical activity. They're releasing neurotransmitters, and then ions go in and out, and it's all electrical. Well, we can't measure that with an MRI machine. So what we do measure is changes in the flow of blood, because we know that wherever you have electrical activity in the brain, you have blood flowing in and out of those regions. And so we use that change in blood flow to say, okay, that part of the brain is active and that part of the brain is not active. So we have people play games where they see pictures and they kind of like push button when they see these pictures. And we use that then to kind of go and look at what brain parts are important. So then anybody that's participating with us, if they get to go and do the sleep part of the study, then they go over to Nicholas Children's Hospital and they participate in the part where we get what's called polysomnography. That's just a fancy word to talk about kind of measuring that electrical activity while people sleep. And so again, our brain is always active, always doing this cool kind of talking to each different parts. And so we can put electrodes, right, just kind of like stickers on the head, and they're sensitive enough to kind of pick up that electrical kind of signal through the skull. So the neurons are talking to each other. That kind of signal is kind of picked up by the electrode that's right here, and then it gets taken to a computer and recorded. And so then while people are sleeping, we measure what the brain's doing. The brain's kind of going up and down and kind of moving around as far as its electrical activity. And so there are different stages of sleep that we can kind of measure. We can look at how different parts, based on what electrodes are talking. So there's lots of ways we can analyze and look at that data. Then when someone wakes up, we have them do more games and we have them answer more questions. And so they do that on the computers and we, record their responses. Then they get to come back one more week later and we do more games. In those games, we do it again back in the MRI machine. And when they're in the MRI machine, again, where they're playing the games, they're pressing buttons and we're measuring brain activity, but through that blood flow. And at that point, we give everybody a little 3D print of their brain.
Oh yes, I was really curious about that.
So this is actually one of our participants' brains. So everybody gets one of these kind of cool brains and they get printed right there on my desk. But so our study then, and basically we can't tell anything from one participant. One participant really is not enough for me to say, oh, I can tell in your superior temporal sulcus that you're paying attention and having emotional memories. No, we need lots and lots and lots of subjects. And so that's why it's really, really important to get people to volunteer and kind of help us understand about how the brain works. Because without volunteers, we could not do anything. We could not discover anything, or we would not know anything.
One of the reasons we have people pressing buttons and playing games is to make sure they're paying attention and doing what we want them to do, so we can interpret the brain signal that we get. Because if we don't know what they're doing, then it's very hard to interpret the information that we're gathering. And what Aaron's talking about is there's also a section where we intentionally have them rest, which then can allow us to ask questions like you're suggesting about like what might be going on while someone who's particularly anxious is at rest relative to someone else. And those are all questions we can ask of the data.